Hello and welcome to the Risen Jesus Podcast with Dr. Mike Licona. Dr. Licona is Associate Professor in Theology at Houston Baptist University, and he is the president of Risen Jesus, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. My name is Kurt Jaris, your host. On today's episode, we continue talking about the historical bedrock for the life of Jesus, and in particular, we'll be looking at his claims for the death and vindication or resurrection that he makes in the Gospels, and what the data is there, the historical bedrock is, and there are certain arguments to be had going back and forth. And I'm not the expert in the room here, but our expert is none other than Dr. Mike Licona. Mike, great to have you here this week with us.
Good to be with you.
You know, I guess I am an expert in something else, theology, but New Testament stuff, you are really the man for the job. And so talk to me about the historical bedrock for the life of Jesus, what we call part 2 here, and particularly Jesus' predictions for his death and vindication / possible resurrection.
Yeah, well, the passion predictions that Jesus would predicted his own death and resurrection is something of great interest to scholars. And is debated amongst them. So I think we've got some decent evidence for it. We can begin by mentioning how the predictions are early. They appear in our first gospel, which most scholars believe is Mark. As we discussed in the previous episode, most scholars, critical scholars, at least those writing in English since 1965, who have mentioned dating of Mark, they think Mark was dated somewhere between the years 50 and 70. With most of them in that category, putting them somewhere between the years 65 and 70. So that's, if we put Jesus' crucifixion in the year 30, which about half the scholars do, the other put it in the year 33. But so at the very most, we're probably looking at 40 years. Mark being 40 years removed from Jesus' death, his life. So that's pretty early, at least by ancient standards. You've got people like Plutarch. Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer, and he is writing, with some of his more recent figures, those of that great period of time of the transition, Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. So that's the time when you got Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus and Brutus and Antony and Cicero. Fascinating time. You know, he's writing. I mean, if you're looking at those events happening, ending around 40 BC, Plutarch is writing just after the year, or let's just call it the year 100. That's 140 years later. So for Mark to be writing 40 years later or less is pretty good. Now, there's a couple of verses in Mark that are of interest. So first of all, you've got Mark chapter 8, around verse 30 and following. So there you have Jesus predict his death and his resurrection. And Peter comes up to him and takes him aside and says, no, this can't happen like this. And actually in the Greek, it says that Peter rebuked Jesus. He rebuked his Lord. And Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter when he sees the others listening in on the conversation. He rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." So you've got almost like two elements here. You've got two elements that are kind of embarrassing. You've got Peter, who is regarded as the first leader of the Christian church. And you've got Peter actually rebuking his Lord. And then you have Jesus turning around and calling him Satan. Now, if that did not happen, if this incident didn't happen, it's unlikely that Mark would have invented, or whoever would, if the tradition was before Mark, it's unlikely that they would invent it and cast Peter in such a negative light, because again, Peter's going to be your first leader of the Christian church. So that seems to weigh in favor of its being an authentic saying of Jesus. Then one chapter later, chapter 9, around verse 31, you've got Jesus predicting his death and resurrection again. And the part where he's predicting his death, that he says the Son of Man will be handed to the hands of men. And you've got like a little play, a rhetorical play going on here called staircasing. So it's like you got the Son of Man will be handed to the hands of men. Man, men, hand, hands. So it's kind of interesting how that happens. Again, that would have been a rhetorical device, which would seem to point to it being an oral tradition of something Jesus, an oral reminiscence of Jesus that was prior to the Gospel of Mark. So you got the staircasing there. You've got the fact that Jesus refers to himself in Mark abundantly as the Son of Man. The later church does not refer to him in that sense. They refer to him as the Son of God, which in essence means the same thing. Son of Man was a divine being that we find in Jewish literature like Daniel 7, 1st Enoch, 4th Ezra. So it in essence means the same thing, but that would seem to suggest it's got a Jewish root and the Son of Man, and that's Jesus' favorite self-designation. So you've got that. You've got the Eucharist sayings of Jesus, that is the sayings about the Last Supper and taking the elements. Not only is that in Mark, but it's even earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians, we don't know exactly when it was written, probably somewhere between the years 53 and 56. And Paul is quoting Jesus there, and he says, I delivered to you what I had also received. Again, these are items, words, terms that denote the imparting of oral tradition. So this is stuff saying, I delivered to you what I had received from the Lord. In other words, this is the Jesus tradition that had been passed along to him. And then he talks about Jesus' sayings about, this is my blood, which is shed for you. This is my body, which is broken for you. So that's very early. So you have that. So you've got these logia, these sayings of Jesus that come from Mark 8:31, Mark 9:31. You've got the Eucharist sayings. Then you've got some. So it's early. It's multiply attested by Mark and the Eucharist sayings, you could say, at least there. There's an embarrassing element to these because when you look at martyrdom literature, it's pretty interesting. When you look at like the Jewish martyrdom literature, Second Maccabees chapter 7, you've got these 7 Jewish brothers, and the Seleucid or Syrian king brings them in because they had weren't following his edict to reject the Jewish eating laws. And they weren't eating pork. So he forces them, tries to force them to eat pork. And they won't do it. And the first brother comes in and the king says to him, I'm going to treat you brutally unless you fix this pork meal right now and eat from it. He won't. So he orders, and the skin is peeled off this guy's head. Well, he still won't eat it. So they cut his tongue out. He still won't fix the meal, so they chop his hands and his feet off. And when he still refuses to do anything, they heat up a large pan until it's red hot and throw him in there alive. And so after seeing what they just did to the eldest brother, they come to the next oldest brother. And they said, we will do the same to you unless you fix this pork meal and eat it. And again, he refuses to do it. And they come to the third one after treating the second one the same way. And basically he just won't do it. He says, in essence, it's either the third or fourth brother that says, King, I'm going to receive these things my tongue and my hands and my feet. I'm going to receive them all back in the resurrection. But for you, O King, there will be no resurrection. So he's trash talking the king. But what's really interesting is in the account, he says these things after he had his tongue cut out. So, there's no way this happened. You can see either this entire story has been fabricated, or it has really been doctored up in order to make these guys, superheroes, probably to encourage others who might find themselves in similar situations. So we find that in Second Maccabees. We find another story in, I believe it's also in Second Maccabees where, no, it's Fourth Maccabees where you have Eleazar and they burn him with fire, and then they pour fluids with a horrible stench. They pour that down his nostrils, and then they burn him to the bone. And just before he dies, he basically says, God, I have not forsaken your law. And then you've got people like Stephen in Acts chapter 6 and 7, the Christian martyr, who, is very bold. He, through being stoned to death, he asked God to forgive them. And you find Rabbi Akiba, a Jewish martyr who was tortured to death. And all these guys, Hananiah ben Teradian, all these guys that in the Jewish martyrdom literature, they're tortured to death. But toward the end, they willingly go into it. And then, they're bold into it. Racks and stones may break my bones, but resurrection awaits me, that kind of stuff. And at the end, they basically say, they pray to God and they say, God, I could have forsaken your law, but I haven't. Now, contrast that with Jesus. He's in the garden. He wants out if possible. Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. He's really sweating over the impending punishment he's going to endure. That would have hardly been encouraging to those disciples to whom he had said, who knows how, just a little bit before then, if you want to be my disciple, you have to be willing to take up your cross and follow me. And then when he's on the cross, he doesn't say, God, I have not forsaken your law. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So this is like it would have really been. They are not airbrushing out of their texts these items that would have made Jesus, look real, not stuff that had been embellished. It's like they're reporting the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so this gives us confidence that they are, at least the synoptic gospels. John seems to have airbrushed a little of these things out of the garden scene, but at least the synoptic gospels, they're reporting these things, even the stuff that would have been embarrassing to the earliest Christians, embarrassing when compared to the Jewish martyrs, reports of the Jewish martyrs. So, those are just two reasons right there. You've got the fact that it's early and they have, embarrassing nature to it. There's some other reasons as well, but those are two right there that would suggest that the Jesus' predictions about his death and resurrection are authentic.
So what are some of the concerns that critics may raise? What seems to be the big deal here, that because Jesus makes these predictions and it happens, that it somehow gives credence to the reliability of the story? What's in it for the critic?
A critic would say, well, this would have required predictive powers, and they don't believe in the supernatural. They don't believe that Jesus was a prophet or son of God, in a divine sense. So if he wasn't, he wouldn't have had these predictive powers. But you know what? Even though it's not to rule out predictive powers, I don't know that you would need predictive powers for some of this. Jesus saw his wingman, John the Baptist, who was out proclaiming, the kingdom of God was coming. He was pointing to Jesus. John the Baptist is arrested and executed, and Jesus is preaching the kingdom of God is in him. And, he's even warned about Herod, and people are trying to trap him, and he's continuing to do stuff. So he must have figured that if he continued on this path, it was eventually going to lead to his execution. So you could make these passion predictions without being a prophet. It's like if you were a missionary and you were preaching Christianity's true and Jesus is the Son of God risen from the dead, and you're doing this in the midst of Al-Qaeda territory. It doesn't take you having supernatural powers if you were to predict your forthcoming execution. Now, resurrection would be a little bit different, but of course, you could believe that you were going to be raised from the dead shortly thereafter. and be deluded on it, so you could think you're going to die and rise from the dead and be correct about the death part, but not about the resurrection part. So the objection that it would require supernatural powers and you're rejecting the supernatural powers is not a very good reason for rejecting these, because you wouldn't really need supernatural powers to do that. Now, if Jesus actually did rise from the dead, then it's probably attributed to supernatural powers, but it's not necessarily so. So that would be one thing. Another would be that Jesus never really thought that he was going to be killed. He believed that he was going to usher in the kingdom of God now, during his lifetime. But he didn't. He failed as Messiah. And so the church, the Christians fabricated these sayings in order to avoid the embarrassing nature of stuff. But I don't think this is a good reason to reject the historicity of the Passion predictions either, because the Gospels report many embarrassing things about the Gospels and Jesus. They say that not even Jesus' brothers believed in him. Well, gosh, if his brothers don't even believe in him and they knew Jesus, why should I, right? They must know him better than I ever will, because they were brought up with him. So that'd be one thing. Why mention that his brothers didn't believe in him? And we find that in John chapter, I believe it's 7, and toward the end of, I believe it's Mark chapter 3, but I'm not sure. It says that his brothers thought he was beside himself. I mean, that's kind of embarrassing. You've got, so his brothers didn't believe in him. You've got Peter saying not to, and that he can't die, and Jesus calling him Satan. You've got women being the discoverers of the empty tomb, while the men were in hiding. You've got, I think it's Mark chapter 3, verse 32, where Jesus says he doesn't know when he's going to return. Well, Mark's presenting Jesus as being God's uniquely divine Son of God, and he doesn't even know when he's coming back. So, and you got all the Gospels are presenting Jesus' disciples as knuckleheads who just don't get things at times. So when they should, and Jesus has to rebuke them and call them men of little faith. So if the Gospels aren't going to be hesitant to refer to give stories and details that would have been kind of embarrassing in nature to Jesus and his disciples, I just don't see where they would feel that they have to fabricate Jesus predicting his death and resurrection if he was a failed Messiah. So that really also just passes over the historical evidence we have that Jesus actually did predict his imminent death and subsequent resurrection. So that be some things. And then you'd have to ask the people who are responding in this way, objecting, you think the Christians are biased. Could it be that you have some bias as well? And could it be that your bias is motivating you to reject the authenticity of these predictions of Jesus about his death and resurrection because it's just not palatable to you? You don't like what it could mean. So that's another. The one that I find most persuasive and find that I have to wrestle with the most is that the disciples didn't seem to anticipate that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. It seemed like a shock to them. And that's kind of strange, I think. If Jesus actually predicted his imminent death and resurrection as much as the Gospels report him doing, then why is it that they weren't thinking about that? Why is it that they don't seem to be expecting it? So, I mean, we can just look at a couple different solutions for that, but the one that I guess that I find perhaps, well, Dale Allison recently said in his book, and it's a fantastic book on the resurrection, just came out this spring of 2021. He allowed me to read it in view of writing a blurb, an endorsement for it. And I read it. It really is an excellent book. It's well done, very scholarly. I mean, it's scholarship at the highest level. It really is. It's a great book. I don't agree with a number of things in it, and we could talk about that another time. But he thinks that when Jesus predicted his death, and resurrection, his resurrection, that he was referring to the general resurrection as a single step rather than two-step, as the Paul presents it later on. Jesus now, and then the rest, everybody else, when Jesus returns. He says that Jesus and his disciples viewed the general resurrection and the Jews as being the last day. It was going to be a single step. And so when Jesus referred to his resurrection, he was thinking it was going to be the general resurrection. Everybody was going to be raised on that day. And that sounded pretty good to me at first. As I think about it, though, it just seems that doesn't really fly well with Jesus' predictions that we find reported in the Gospels. All of them seem to be pointing just to him rising from the dead. And just him. He's not saying, 3 days later, we will all be raised. He's saying, I'm going to die and then I'm going to be raised 3 days later. So, of course you could say, well, the church just changed that afterward, but where's your evidence for that? I mean, that's just pure speculation. It's not to say that it couldn't happen that way. It's possible. But I just think it's probably more likely that the reason they weren't anticipating it is because, for one, they really balked at the idea of the Messiah dying and rising. They wanted God's kingdom to be ushered in now so that they could be free from Roman domination. That's not what Jesus was presenting them. And maybe they were hoping that Jesus would change his mind later on. I mean, when you got Peter saying, Lord, you said you're going to die and rise 3 days later. No, that can't be that way. I mean, they're taking that as just Jesus saying he's going to be raised, right? And that appears to be an authentic saying of Jesus because of the embarrassing nature of it. Plus it's early, it's in Mark. So I think that militates against a view such as what Allison holds, that everything seems to be pointing to Jesus. But I think it's, maybe Jesus' predictions weren't quite as crystal clear as we find them in the Gospels. Maybe they may have been, but there might have been a little ambiguity to it. And then the disciples weren't really open to dying and rising Messiah. They wanted something else. They were hoping that Jesus would change his mind or that he was wrong. And it was only later, after he had been raised from the dead, that they just came to understand that this was necessary. So that's what I would surmise is the reason why they weren't anticipating that Jesus would come back from the dead.
Yeah, and in the chapter here, in this section, you do provide some other possible or even plausible other possibilities, that could have happened. But, as you've just stated, you think the best reason here is their expectations were far different. We're coming to a close here, but before we do, I want to take a question from one of your listeners, Mike. He calls himself Banjo Skeptic on Twitter here, at Banjo Atheist. Big issue for me as a skeptic. Luke says many had written about Jesus. We also think there's Q, so we know that there's lots missing from the record. How do you know that stuff wouldn't hurt you, or presumably he means hurt your case? Or is your resurrection belief more a pragmatic assent?
Well, that's a fair question. I guess the truth of the matter is there could be something that would overturn what we believe. I mean, we know that Paul wrote some other letters that we don't have today. At the end of Colossians, he talks about a letter to the church at Laodicea. We know that there was a letter that he wrote to the church at Corinth before 1 Corinthians because he alludes to that letter. So what if one of those lost letters of Paul, turned up? And it said something that would just totally would give such illumination to the whole thing, it would tell us for certain that Christianity was false. What if the Q document were discovered and, it had some things in it that we don't find in Matthew and Luke, and that something like some had said Jesus had been raised, but he really wasn't. This is what happened instead. What if we had something like that? Well, we can't rule out the possibility of something like that as historians, but we don't have to wait based on, a what if. I mean, you could say, well, there's scientific laws or beliefs that we have today that we hold really strongly. Well, what if in the future we find that there is something else that overturns us. Well, that's possible, but we don't have to wait for that to reject what we presently believe. We believe right now that, we perceive reality relatively accurate. The external reality is pretty much as we perceive it. But is it possible that we're all just brains in vats being stimulated by a mad scientist to have these external perceptions? Sure. But I can't really look at that as a serious live option. I've got to look at data to support things. And we do have multiple data, like from Paul. You'd still have to say, well, why did Paul convert to Christianity? That has to be answered. What was the nature of these experiences that led so many people to believe the risen Jesus had appeared to them, despite seeing him executed in a very brutal manner? Again, with Paul, he's the most important one here because he was out persecuting the church, and then he makes an about face to the point where he's proclaiming the risen Jesus, telling people to repent and become followers of Jesus, and he does this to his own harm. Shipwreck, beatings, imprisonments, and eventual beheading, martyrdom. So, what would cause this? You have to account for those things. So while we could say that there is a very small, remote possibility that some of these lost letters would, lost documents would disprove or overturn what we currently believe about Jesus, wise people look at probabilities, and we look at all the data that we have, and the data we have is quite strong, at least strong enough that a heterogeneous consensus of historians of Jesus grant things like that he died by crucifixion, that he was known as a miracle worker, an exorcist, that he believed himself to be God's eschatological agent, that he died by crucifixion, that he taught in parables and things like that. Now, I do want to say this before we close. We talked about Jesus' predictions about his death and resurrection. That does not belong to historical bedrock, by the way. Because even though I think the evidence for it is every bit as strong as some of the others, it's not granted by a heterogeneous consensus of scholars today. So I don't include it in the historical bedrock.
Interesting. Yeah, and I just wouldn't have a problem with people having predictive powers. I mean, there are some people that predicted the housing crash, back in, 08, 09. There are people that saw it coming. And yeah, like you said, I mean, Jesus could have seen John the Baptist and thought, hey, that's my impending fate. So no problem there. And to at Banjo Atheist, right? Yeah, Mike, you mentioned Luke. Here that Luke mentions there are many sources. Well, if you go back to season 2 of our podcast, if you think Luke wrote third of the synoptics, he could be referring to Mark and Matthew and maybe one other that was out there. So it doesn't seem probable, as you mentioned, it doesn't seem probable that there's going to be something that really throws a monkey in the wrench here. So yeah, great. Well, I'm glad you could help guide us through those thoughts, Mike. It's always nice to hear your perspective on some of the questions from your listeners. And also, too, as we're working through the predictions that Jesus made about the death and his coming resurrection and how that plays into the overall case being made here. And in this particular instance, yeah, you see, hey, this doesn't really fall within the bedrock, but it's still valuable. And, I think it's historical, but it's not part of this case that's being made here as these minimal facts go on. And so looking forward to even meatier material coming up in the coming weeks as we look at Jesus' death, the appearances, Paul you brought up, and James. We've got a lot of great content coming forward. Looking forward to those conversations with you. If you'd like to learn more about the work and ministry of Dr. Mike Licona, you can visit risenjesus.com, where you can find authentic answers to genuine questions about the reliability of the Gospels and the resurrection of Jesus. If this podcast has been a blessing to you, please consider becoming one of our monthly partners. Go to risenjesus.com/donate. This has been the Risen Jesus Podcast, a ministry of Dr. Mike Licona.